Hey guys, Matt from Pomelo Pictures here, and we are back with another video with the Immortal John Hancock, all the way from Washington in the US. John, thank you for joining us again.
Always a
Um,
pleasure.
how are things going over there?
Muggy. It's kind of muggy outside. I moved from California, so I'm used to the heat. Not used to the humidity though. It's not hot here. It's just kind of muggy.
Hmm.
It's kind of a sweltering. I don't know. It's just I'm not used to it. A little uncomfortable.
I wish I
But
could
oh
tell
well.
you what it's like outside here, but it's 4 a.m. and it's pitch black, so I can't really. But anyway, the reason why I wanted to do this video was I told you before we started recording. In our last video, which was a two-part video, both on my channel and on yours, we talked a little bit about motivations behind why we collect, and one of those motivations was sort of a desire to be not necessarily just preserving games, but kind of using them as a way of educating people of games, but also of technology of the past. And also, you spoke about your museum and how you wanted to use that and use your channel in the meantime as kind of your virtual museum, your way of educating people of these
Hmm.
things in the past. And within the last week or so, we live on quite a small island here, so quite close knit community, and we were hosting a family, and they had two young kids, one of which was an 11-year-old boy, and he was already coding games in Unity. And he kind of knew that I'd done a few things with video games, didn't really know, and came and saw my studio here, which is not quite, well, nowhere near the size of your Room of Doom, but he only had kind of a passive knowledge of previous generations of consoles. He kind of knew, well, there's a PS4, so there must be a PS3 1, I guess. Xbox One, didn't really know. And he kind of knew of like the Nintendo Wii and things before it, but he had no idea there was this long history of games. And as we started talking more and more about not just games, but the technology of it and the history of it, it was kind of obvious that even though he had a sort of working knowledge of what games are and sort of the technology behind them, the history of it wasn't really there. And you can't really get a sense of that playing emulators or playing Atari flashbacks or anything like that. It's something you need to have that's tangible and be able to see the real thing. And that's what made me want to talk to you, because not only are you a guy that is very much about having the real thing, you are an educator as well. You're a teacher, aren't you?
Hmm. Yes. Yeah, and also I teach second grade, but I taught college for 5 years, intro to
Mm.
game development, and I incorporated video game history into that. And it was a great opportunity. It was too far away, but I had to commute probably about an hour and a half one way for
Mm.
5 years.
Yeah,
And
well,
so,
I've done
but
that before.
yeah, and but it was great. As I essentially have a collection that not many people can. I can bring an Odyssey one to
Mm.
class and show it working on a television set, and bringing a Bally Astrocade and bringing the original, Apple II,
Mm.
and just stuff like that, where I can bring that out of my collection, talk about it, and it's such a enlightening experience to have a student who wants to get into the game field, but have them experience something that was so important,
Yeah.
in game history for the first time. It changed a lot of them. They said after they experienced Oregon Trail on an Apple II, or playing a Commodore 64 on the actual Commodore 64,
Mm.
it really impacted them.
Yeah, because it is more about the experience as well as just being able to play the actual game. So being able to play it on the original hardware. But um, I mean, for you, I mean, also, well, for both of us, really, we are of a generation where we did actually grow up with these things. So the
Hmm.
the games themselves aren't just it's not the fact that it's just something that exists. It's linked to our memories as well. We've had sort of first-hand
Hmm.
experiences of when these were new, and not to be rude, you are of a slightly older generation than me. That there are some things that I never experienced before. Like I never experienced the Atari 2600 when it was new. That was one thing I will never have that
Right.
experience. So that's why with some of the YouTubers I watch, I like to watch people who had those memories where it's not just they have knowledge of it, they have sort of first-hand experience of when it was new.
I think generations have perspectives of games, and I definitely find. How old are you, might I ask?
I'm 28.
Okay, I figured you're about your late 20s. So people your age have a much different. Typically, your generation has a much typically different generation opinion of Atari.
Yeah,
and that's okay, because when I grew up, there was a time when you didn't have better, so you kind of dealt with you either
of course,
play on your Atari or don't play anything at home, and so it really changes your perspective. Now, if I was introduced to Atari now and I had not experienced that or had no, I don't know, like connection, I would have probably thought it was pretty terrible.
You're not wrong, no, but I mean,
and
you need to be able to put it into context as well.
Yep.
And that's the important. I mean, what were your first experiences with video games? Not necessarily in the arcade, but more sort of as a home technology.
Well, my first experience home was a Pong clone by Radio Shack called TV Scoreboard.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was my first console. I remember playing with my brother. And for people that aren't familiar with it, it was essentially Pong.
Yeah.
In which I had a smaller controller, and if my brother didn't like how the game was going, he could just turn the game off.
From his controller.
He did that on his controller, which had all the controls of the game.
Sort of early rage quitting.
Yeah, early rage quitting, and again, I grew up with Pong, so I have a connection with Pong and the aesthetics, and really kind of delved into the history of that. But for people that didn't, they're gonna have a different perspective, and every generation is gonna have that. I also think it's kind of interesting that every generation has kind of sometimes a lot of bias opinions about their games were the best.
Yeah.
Or their generation had the best. Well, we really knew what games was about.
Well, that's nostalgia, isn't it?
Yeah, and I teach in a psychology class. Definitely delved into that, where every generation has things that they think that they do better than other people, and it's really interesting. But game generation's no different, And there's a lot of people. I hear a lot of younger people that don't like Atari, and I get it.
I understand it. Yeah, I mean, one thing that was I think a little bit not necessarily daunting for him, but he was struggling to understand it, is because he's definitely of the generation now where physical media doesn't really well, it does exist, but I mean, now games, if you buy a game on a disc for the Xbox One or the PS4, it's really just to authorize that that's an official copy. The game is downloads onto a hard drive. It's not you can't just pull it off a shelf and play it straight away. And one thing that really pointed that out, and I think it sort of showed the importance of owning your media, was I pulled where is it here? I pulled Halo 5 off the shelf. It was the first time I actually put it into the machine, because he really wanted to play it, and it obviously needed to download, and then it needed to update, and he was here the whole afternoon, and it still hadn't finished. So we never got playing. But whereas we were able to basically point at something on a shelf and go, "Oh, what's that?" and go, put it in, turn it on, play it for a few minutes, and go, "Oh, okay, I understand that now. Well, but what's that?" and go, and okay, there were no downloading. And I think it's, I think we touched upon it in our last video. It's kind of, we're going digital with everything, whether it's movies, music, games, and there's going to be a point where the games that kids grow up with or grew up with aren't going to be available in that format. And for something for my generation and older, maybe even a little bit younger, it's a strange idea that a game that you grew up with and you have so many memories with, you can't get anymore. You just can't get it. It doesn't exist. The server's gone. Or another one we were playing was we were playing Overwatch and Splatoon, and these are great games, but they only exist online. There's not really a single player for these. But being able to sort of also having something tangible, being able to show, okay, you can have an online tutorial now, but hey, this is the manual. This is,
Yep.
this isn't something digital. It's something physical. I can own it. I can hold it in my hand. Say these are the characters and this is what they do. And why I really wanted to show that was we were playing Overwatch and there's no guide to it. I was kind of like, well, there's all these characters. There's 20 different characters with all these different abilities. You can't even buy a guide. Like there's a couple, but they're I had to import them from America or whatever. There's nowhere I can read what all the best abilities for all these characters were, and it's kind of like, well, no, this is what gaming was like when I was younger. We got the manual, we opened it up, we knew what all the characters were, and that's kind of something that's a little bit lost now, and it's a shame, but at the same time, it's nice to be able to show someone, oh, actually, that was something from the past that arguably we did better.
Yep. Well, ownership, you really hit on a very interesting point where we are getting away from ownership, and it's before we owned the game, and now we get permission to play a game, and it's a big difference, and it's a change in how companies are looking at people playing games. And the truth of the matter is the online connectivity of a game is where a company makes all its profits. And so Rockstar just announced that all of their money from Grand Theft Auto is all part connected to the Grand Theft Auto Online part of the game. And that's the truth of the matter. That's where the money is, and that's where the games are going to go. And multiplayer is such an important aspect of games now, and I really, it's been that way for a while. It was on PCs before consoles. Consoles kind of caught up, and now it's just everything. Where there's multiplayer is such an important aspect of I would say a majority of games. There's still single player games out there, but for the most part, having that online connectivity, and the truth is, eventually servers go down. And that part of the game is gone. It's just gone.
Yeah, and if it's 90 to 100% of the game, then I'm sure there will be people that sort of preserve servers in the future or so on. But whether you can do that on consoles, I don't know. You can do it on
Xbox. You can original Xbox. You can. Essentially, what you can do is just have you'd have to get a bunch of people together,
sure,
and system link your console. But then you can do kind of a quasi, it's still physical media and you're still connecting to people, but you're playing with a group of people on a multiplayer aspect of the game. And only certain games can do that, but that's kind of the hybrid. But after that, any MMO game, any game that had that was solely relied on multiple people playing at once, that's going to be gone.
Because one thing you also mentioned when we were talking about your museum was that you wanted to be able to have like a room where it's almost like set up where it's almost like this, with the Atari room, you could almost walk in. It's like walking into the 70s, and multiplayer, as you were mentioning, multiplayer was one thing that came up because I showed him GoldenEye, which was a big game growing up for me. Not everybody loves it, but for me, there's a lot of memories attached to that game.
I love it.
But the idea of, I've only got a very small CRT over there, but the idea of 4 people huddling around a CRT with a 4-way split screen, he was just a little bit like, what? He had a vague understanding of split screen co-op from like Call of Duty or something, but he's 11 years old. He hasn't played Call of Duty that much or anything. And obviously he knows things like FIFA, but there's no split screen there. They're just one side of the screen. So the idea of 4 people huddled around a little CRT where they're all playing on the same screen at the same time with 4 controllers plugged into the same console, no online, just local, was something that blew his mind a little bit. And I like that because that's something that blew my mind when I was younger.
Absolutely.
I mean, what are your memories of not necessarily local multiplayer but local co-op? I mean, what were your first experiences with that? Was it Pong,
Combat.
I guess? Oh, Combat.
Combat. Well, Pong would be first, and then Combat on an actual console. Playing Combat and getting my butt kicked by my cousin. I was the youngest, and I got schooled pretty good because they would just beat me up. They would you can juggle people in Combat. You can even move the bullets and stuff with the joysticks, and it's a fun game, but you can juggle people pretty bad in it.
Hmm.
But yeah, I mean, I go back to the Atari days. Warlords being another great game. Indy 500.
Hmm.
So many great couch multiplayer games on the 2600, and that some of that's lost. I think the Switch has kind of really kind of advertised as being that console to do that again.
Yeah.
Ironically, you can't do that with Splatoon 2, but
No,
you can do that. But you can do it with ARMS,
I think the
and
new
there's
Mario Kart you can as well.
Street Fighter 2, Ultra, and Bomberman, and games like that, like 1-2 Switch,
Hmm.
games like that, or Sniffer Clips. It's that couch multiplayer
Hmm.
aspect of it that's really neat.
Hmm.
And other games have done that, but I think that's really a different and unique gaming experience that you can't duplicate with online play.
No.
And I think with going back to the idea of a museum, I think if you're going to do a museum, you need to capture the gaming experiences from each generation.
Hmm.
When you said GoldenEye,
Yeah.
I immediately thought of college days for me. When I was in
Hmm.
college, GoldenEye was huge,
Yeah.
and we played GoldenEye, and it was so much fun. 4 controllers. We didn't care about what high definition TV we had.
Nope.
Essentially everybody had some big ugly TV, and you just bring your N64 controller over, and we set up the rules. No
odd job.
No odd job. We had certain rules, and we played, and it was fun. And that was early gaming multiplayer, couch multiplayer, and for college for me. But even going back to the original Nintendo days, we were playing Contra.
Yeah.
Playing Contra, which it wasn't called Contra over there. It was called
Probotector.
Probotector. That's right. So played that. That was really popular. Tecmo Bowl, which is an American football game, that was really popular here. Played a lot. Played a lot at Tecmo Super Bowl. Yeah, the list goes on and on.
I think I think it is a slightly generational thing. I mean, randomly, what came on TV a few days ago was a behind-the-scenes thing of the filming of the TV show Friends.
Okay.
And they would take you back to, and I think it was the props guys. They sort of showed you that, and they were all playing Mario Kart on an N64. All 4 of them sat together, and it's kind of like, well, that's kind of. I mean, the Switch, as you say, it is bringing it back a little bit, but I mean, with that, it's a little bit different because in some way it's being marketed as, if you have a Switch, obviously you can take it with you and you can have this local multiplayer and you've all got it on your screen. Obviously, some things like Mario Kart and so on, you have that split screen, but yeah, it's not just about the game existing. It's about sort of that experience and showing somebody that is a younger generation that hasn't had that experience. They might have played local multiplayer, but more likely they've played multiplayer online with their friends when one friend is at home and they've got a headset on, and it's not quite the same as sort of being next to somebody whilst they're beating you, and the sort of frustration of having to look at the smugness on their face. That's kind of a game experience that's hard to replicate. But it's
even the controllers, even showing someone an N64 controller hasn't seen it. My son was like, "Dad, why does it have a tail?" I go, "What are you talking about?" He's like, "The thing in the middle, it grew a tail.
Well,
that controller's got a tail."
Well, when I put it in his hands, he was like, "Okay, there's only one analog stick? Okay." And then he was holding it with 2 hands, and then we said, "How do I even fire?" It's like, no, you have to hold the middle one, and there's a button on the back. And it was kind of like, he didn't quite understand it, but this kind of, it's an appreciation, I guess, is the kind of thing. It's not because at one point in time, that was cutting edge. I mean, obviously, there are things to do with sort of cartridges versus discs and so on and so forth. But at the same time, that was, GoldenEye, although it's been done better now, was kind of one of the gold standards for multiplayer shooters. And that's something that doesn't necessarily come across if somebody just picked it up without somebody sat with them going, well, no, this is why it was good. Because, as you say, with the Atari, it could just go over somebody's head. But on that point, one of the questions was why do game developers favor discs these days? And it's kind of like, well, they kind of don't, because you download games. But I went into we won't for the purpose of people watching. We don't need to go into the whole history of get cartridges versus discs or whatever, and the
Hmm.
advantages and the costs and of developing those. But that was one thing that was great to talk about because it was it's something that shaped the history of games, but it also was something to do with the gaming industry. It was a business decision in some
Hmm.
aspects.
Absolutely.
N64, they could have been on discs, but they went down the cartridge route because of piracy
Piracy.
issues.
Yep.
But it was more expensive. They couldn't
Yep.
fit as many on there, and
They
they'd
lost
been
companies because of it.
and made companies with like the PlayStation. When I mentioned the words
Yeah.
Nintendo PlayStation, as in the SNES with his was it Nintendo PlayStation, but that's that's not just the history of gaming, but that's an introduction to business as well. That's putting business into a context that kids can understand. Sort of, well, the N64 existed because of this reason. The PlayStation existed because of this reason, and why some were discs, some were games. That's why it's gone a certain way. Nowadays, handhelds are back on not necessarily cartridges, but they're back on these because now you can fit 64 128 gig quite
Yep.
easily on a little bit of flash memory. And it's not just about the experiences of gaming, it's kind of understanding technology in that context as well, because with music, it's kind of, apart from a vinyl, a comeback of vinyl, it's almost all digital now. And not only is it all digital, people aren't owning the digital they're streaming, and it's going a little bit that way with movies as well. But
Yep.
with games, at least, there is still, at the moment, there is an emphasis on owning the game. But it's not quite the same as owning the disc or owning the cartridge. But there is a whole backlog of history of why
Hmm.
things are the way they are that way. And that was really cool to go into as well, because it's just not something that people really experience anymore. Yes, that comes on a disc on an Xbox One or a PS4, but at the same time, it is a download. It's not that piece of physical media. And companies don't necessarily need to worry about whether cartridges or discs are better and piracy and so on, because they can write it all in software now. And that's
Yep.
kind of something that the idea of company going down one route because of possible piracy is kind of an odd concept now. I mean, obviously, if it's a digital only, I know from working with Sega, we know going into it there's going to be a certain amount of piracy, and we just accept it. But to think that piracy was a big enough deal for why the N64 was on cartridges, why the GameCube is on mini DVDs or mini CDs. It's a strange concept for somebody to grasp nowadays. You
Yeah.
change your whole way of how a console looks and how games look, and how the model of how third parties develop with you, purely based on the idea of anti-piracy, whereas other companies like PlayStation didn't care. That's another thing. That's a whole other aspect of it. That's a whole other business side of it than just the gaming experience. But I mean, for me, I mean, did you experience any of that growing up? I mean, with Atari, they were all cartridges. But were there any kind of moments where it kind of, the business aspect of it kind of hampered the experience or enhanced the experience?
Well, yeah. I mean, so I had quite the experiences with computers,
Mm,
and I talk about this when I was on the Not So Common podcast with
yeah.
Pat Contry, and ironically, I was at people's homes who were fairly conservative and in law abiding people, and went to church, and they were good people, and yet they had tons and tons of copied Commodore 64 games,
Yeah.
and it was a business decision to go the route of floppy floppy disk because they were
Hmm.
cheap,
Yeah.
and it supported a community that essentially was kind of you could make a video game in a garage
Yeah.
and sell it in a Ziploc bag with instructions. I know correct me if I'm wrong, Commodore 64 overseas was sold a lot on cassette tape.
Yeah. It
That
was.
was
Yeah.
very popular, and it was more floppy disk here. And I don't know the reason why, but what I do know is that both reasons were because the public accepted that media.
Hmm.
But it also meant that people had what's called copy parties, and they would bring their games together, and they would, link up your 1541 drives
Yeah.
and have a copy party.
I
And
didn't know that. I didn't know that was a
and
thing that happened.
people would get together and duplicate games, and I'm sure Commodore knew about it, and it probably blossomed their business. It made the computer even more popular because you could play cheap games. Because really what it came down to, especially when the Tramiels were involved, was we made profit on selling this computer. And the software, I'm sure that they made a lot of the software for the C64 was third party. And I'm sure they made some money on that, but really it was the hardware they were making money on.
Yeah.
But to go back, I saw many business decisions when things went to CD.
Yeah.
I liked that. I liked that a lot just because I was tired of loading multiple discs into a computer, and people that haven't experienced that. I mean, when you have like a game like TIE Fighter and it's multiple discs, and you find that one of your discs is corrupt, it is very, very, very annoying. Now these days, if your game doesn't download right, you just delete it and re-download it. No big deal.
Or contact somebody, and by social media or something, they get back to you pretty quickly. And unless you're Hello Games, but that's another matter. But you make a good point, because I mean, sometimes piracy was what made a console successful. Like the irony of the Sony PlayStation not existing because Nintendo were scared of piracy, and then the success of PlayStation happening because because you could pirate games easily. It's an odd concept, I guess, for somebody to say no. Piracy helped the console because people were buying more consoles, and then in the end,
cheap media helped really PlayStation, because I worked at a game store when Sony PlayStation was really hitting its strong point. So I was working at a GameStop, and it's hard to pinpoint the actual hire date for me, but in 1998 to like 2001, I was involved with working at GameStops. And you could walk into a GameStop and there was 3-to-1 software versus N64.
Yeah.
And a parent would come in and say, I want to get a game. What games does your kid like? Well, he likes this, this, and this. And it was hard not to sell him on PlayStation because A, it was half the price, and B, there was 3 times the software.
Yeah, well, they were cheap to produce, so you could stock the stores up. Cartridges, you had to hedge your bets. You had to figure out how many you were going to sell and try and get that bang on. Otherwise, you lost a lot of money because cartridges were so expensive to develop, not just to sell. Not to buy for the consumer. The companies lost money if they didn't sell cartridges too.
Well, and the prices too, so people would wait for an N64 game, and the new game would come out. It'd be up to $70.
Oh yeah.
And then people would look over and see the Sony PlayStation one, and it would be the same game. Sometimes would have a $30 difference. It would be $39.99, and then people would be like, "Well, what's the difference?" Well, that might look a little bit better on the N64, but it's essentially the same game.
Yeah.
So.
You're absolutely right. Sometimes it's a hard sell, and that's another aspect of it. The consumerism of it isn't as much a factor these days as well, because I know from when we were selling games, it's a weird thing where having something in a store isn't as important as it used to be. Obviously you could go into a store and you could buy a download code for our game.
I know, I've seen it. It's weird.
Or you could just download it. And obviously I understand it in terms of gifting and so on, and the same with Xbox and PS4, less so with the Switch, but having something actually physically in a store is not as important, because you could go to a store and go, oh, okay, they're sold out. I'll go download it instead. And it's kind of like, that wasn't a thing. If the game was sold out, you had to go to another store. And you're absolutely right. If it came down to it and there were more PlayStation versions available than the N64, then someone might get frustrated. If they were between the two, which console to buy, they might just get frustrated and go, well, I can't find the games. If something is selling constantly, also, that's the one thing, the the time at which it took to make a cartridge was a lot longer than PlayStation. So if the game sold out, you'd have to be waiting. You'd be waiting longer for the N64 than you would the
Yep.
PlayStation. So you're absolutely right. That would affect consumer decisions just because they weren't in store. I actually hadn't thought of it that way from a sort of store's point of view as well. For somebody who sells games, that made more sense, I guess, to sell
Yeah.
things that were on CD as well.
Yeah, we had games that would sell out, and just people would say, "Well, when's the next one come in?" Well, it might be a couple weeks,
Yeah.
and we get a shipment in. I remember Rockstar made a monster truck game for the N64. I forget what it's monster truck. It wasn't that great a game, but it was popular, and we only got 2 copies in. And I remember like there was a waiting list for like a month, because every week we'd get like a couple copies of the game in, and people would be there to pick it up. So frustrating. So
I'm sort of trying not to go too deep into some things, because honestly, this is a topic we could probably talk for hours and hours upon. So I'll end sort of games as an education point at that point. But before we end it, there was one thing that I wanted to talk about, and that was kind of, rather than the history of it and the technology of it and so on, but using games as an educational tool. Obviously, people have spoken a lot about Minecraft and how it's great for especially kids with like learning difficulties and things, because it's kind of taken the idea that was probably first brought through with Lego, like this idea of unrivaled creativity. You can create anything, but the problem with Lego is Lego wasn't cheap, so you could never have enough bricks to do whatever you wanted. With Minecraft, there's not that much of an issue. You just go at it, and you can work collaboratively with people and things. But I mean, with you as an educator, but I guess also as a parent, I mean, this is one thing that I haven't experienced yet. I haven't had my own kids, but for someone who has that vast back catalogue of games, have you used, either with students or with kids, any video games in particular as an educational tool?
Yeah. So in second grade, I had, and again, this is my first time in second grade in like over 10 years. I got permission from my principal on the last week to bring in, like the last couple weeks, to bring in and incorporate classic video games into lesson plans. I really used Oregon Trail. Now I live in the Northwest, so Oregon Trail is kind of, it's a great tie-in to local history, and so I taught my students resource management using that game.
Oh wow!
And if you haven't played it, it's amazing.
I know of Oregon Trail, but it wasn't as big here as it was over in the US. I mean, we generally, because schools were able to get hold of them, the computers that I had in school was the BBC Micro. Not really big outside of the UK, but it's kind of because it was a school supported thing. But
absolutely.
And now we're going through a similar thing with, I don't think it's Raspberry Pi, but there is a similar thing to Raspberry Pi. That is again a BBC thing that is going out into schools, and they're learning to code on it. But it is more learning to code than necessarily just using the games. But I never really had that experience with like Oregon Trail or anything like.
So Oregon Trail, Tetris would be another one of like space management, spatial relations, and again, the lesson plan, Minecraft. I did Minecraft, and so there's so many games that you can incorporate some great stuff. And you just you have to work at it. Definitely, it's not just like, oh, this is educational. You have to get a lesson plan around that. But I would say the number one game for education, hands down, probably in the world, is Minecraft.
Yeah.
Just because you can do so much, it's relevant, it's popular. You don't have to sell it to a kid. You can just say Minecraft, and I would say at least a younger generation of kids, they're going to know what Minecraft is. Even if they haven't played it a lot, they've seen it.
Yeah.
They've seen the characters on people's shirts. You can do a lot in that game. Counting, spatial relations, area. I mean, there's so much you can do. And I think that games is the future for educating. And I think that game companies, when I grew up, educational games weren't that great. I mean,
Hmm.
other than outside of Oregon Trail and some others, but I think now game companies are realizing that it's a huge market, and it's been
Yeah.
a huge market for a while. But the good educational games and websites, that's a huge market,
Hmm.
you know.
And
And I
it doesn't just have to be an educational game specifically. I mean,
yeah,
in the last video, I mentioned a quote from Video Games the Movie, and I went back and watched it. I've got it here somewhere, where it was sort of games providing an environment for children to fail safely, and sort
yep,
of giving them that concept of, well, it's okay to fall flat on your face every now and then. But
hmm
that's how you build yourself up. That's how you get success. But whilst I was watching it, there was also another guy talking about he'd spoken to a 6-year-old girl who knew what a trebuchet was, like an ancient catapult, and knew not only what it was but how it worked, and she had opinions on how effective it was and things. And he was so jealous because he'd grown up with a textbook where it's a black and white image trying to portray what it was, and it's like, oh no, she's used one in a digital environment, and she has her opinions on whether a catapult or a trebuchet are better, and so on and so forth. And it's strange because it's an understanding that we would have never been able to have as kids, and our parents before us even less so. It's kind of like we were one of the first generations where that was a thing, where we could manipulate things in a digital environment and see what works and what doesn't. Before us, before our generation, our parents, they never had that kind of thing. So it's encouraging to think what the next generation is going to be able to do, because the idea of gaming and simulation is becoming a little bit blurred now, with like
yep,
not just with VR but also with augmented reality as well. The
or mixed
idea
reality. Yep,
Exactly, yeah. The idea
yep,
that you'll be able to manipulate digital environments and the environment around you as well, but in a safe way, is a really interesting thing from an educational point of view, because it's something that, previous generations never had. But it is this idea that you can try things out, and you'd be able to do it with, from a business sense point as well. You'd be able to try things out cheaply because it either works or it doesn't work, and then it's a simulation and it's done, and it's going to mold the way kids' minds work, and it's something we didn't
absolutely.
have.
Absolutely, I really think mixed reality, the Hololens of all the technologies I've seen for education moving forward,
Hmm.
I've been most impressed with Microsoft's unreleased device. Whether
Yeah,
or not it ever comes to fruition, or I mean, I know there's some problems with it, but I the mix the as an educator,
yeah,
to show my kids Oregon Trail, have
hmm.
them put on a lens and show them something from that time period, or
Yeah,
like, I mean, that's powerful. I mean, that
hmm.
would be really powerful to show that, or to show them a time period, or take them to a different planet,
Hmm.
and or show them this is what this species of lizards look like in
Hmm.
their natural habitat in the rainforest, or I mean, you could just go on and on. And
Hmm.
so, but I'm really excited to see that, like, kind of going back to what you said, where simulation is kind of blurring the line. It's like the lines are becoming blurred.
Hmm.
I think that's going to be really neat to see the technology and how that advances.
Yeah, but it was also quite encouraging because I mean, even though it's going to be the games and the software developers and things that drive those experiences, it was nice that whilst we are on the burgeoning of that, we can see YouTubers playing their part as kind of the way you put it last time was the best, in that it's kind of like a virtual museum, but it's not just a virtual
Mm-hmm.
museum. It's kind of like a virtual classroom as well. Like,
Yeah,
I can see Metal Jesus doing his augmented reality video and showing what it is. For someone who's never seen it before, they go, "Oh wow!" And
yeah.
they can see what it is. John Riggs, if somebody wants to
Oh,
develop games, go watch some of his hacking 8-bit games. You can get an
yeah.
education to begin with on how to start manipulating code and sprites and so on, and then you can work your way up. And people like you and other YouTubers that are kind of highlighting not just the history of it, but the logical progression of what we started off at this and now we are here. But
Mm-hmm.
kind of how we got there is something that's sometimes glossed over. Like, one of the questions, he was looking at Cartridge, and it's like, but how how do developers get the game onto that thing?
Yep.
And I was like, okay, well, let's open it up and I'll show you. Well, this is the ROM board. Here's the ROM chip. No, let's open up a few more. Notice this one's got a battery on it. Well, that's because there was no flash memory and you had to have there's no hard drives. You had to have a battery on it. That's almost essentially kept the game on in some not quite, but that's kind of. Here's Star Fox. This was one of the first 3D games. It had to have this extra chip here because, you didn't need to upgrade your console necessarily. You had room to expand the cartridge and kind of. And that understanding of, well, that's the building block of, oh, okay, that's where the code is in that chip. Okay, well, what's the code? How did that work back in the day? Oh, okay, well, I've been looking at Unity. I understand how that works now, and it's kind of like layering things up and giving them a better understanding. And that was it was this week, and that's kind of my first experience with my collection and my YouTube channel, sort of starting what we spoke about last time and what I wanted my channel to do. It's kind of like, well, that's great that we're able to do that, and it sort of encourages me going forward, and people like you as well that want to move forward with your museum as well. It's kind of, well, it kind of reaffirmed that there is that interest in the younger generation, that it's not just about the latest games, it's not just about what's next gen. They want to know where games came from, because
oh yeah,
the look on his face when he walked in, and obviously, my collection is so much smaller than yours, but he actually went, whoa, okay, I didn't understand this was a thing. I didn't understand that games went back this far. There was this many. I was kind of like, but I don't have any complete collections or anything. You have no idea how much there is. And it was kind of, it just kind of reaffirmed that, okay, well, I've started my YouTube channel for a reason, and hey, there's a kid down the road that is interested in it. Well, even if I help him, then it's worth it.
Yep, absolutely. It definitely is. It's really neat when you get someone that's excited about being into something, or you feel like you've helped them out, or expanded their understanding of something. Kind of like Luke Skywalker when he first found out about the Force in Star Wars. And it's really neat to see a kid or a person just like, what? That it worked like that, or it looked like that, And my son was thinking that the N64 was like the original controller, and I go, oh no,
we're just scraping the surface.
What do you mean? He's like, I'll show you one of the original controllers. Well, first I showed him Pong.
Yeah.
I go, the original controller wasn't a controller; it was a knob.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh, okay. Well, what came after that? Then I showed him Atari, which he played as a kid, like when he was really young. And I go, yep, joystick and one button. Doesn't get much more simple than that.
Yeah.
But
as I said, it's just, that's what I was saying. There's that logical progression. But if you just look at an Xbox One or a PS4 controller or even a PC keyboard and you think, okay, but what was before that? You can trace back the layers of complexity in gaming, and why is there no analog stick on an NES? Well, because there weren't really any 3D games. Why is the original PlayStation not got any analog sticks, and then suddenly there's two? Well, because that's the sort of movement into 3D games, and why you needed that to manipulate that. And you need one which is the X-axis, one that's the Y-axis, one that moves the camera, one that moves the play, and it's kind of it's that base knowledge of not just gaming. It's teaching kids to look back on certain things to see logical progression in all areas, not just technology but everything. But it's really encouraging that something that you are doing and I am doing, and kind of it is something that is interesting to future generations. And as I said when we first started talking about it, it's good for us to do it because we can put it into context. We have those memories of what it was like. It's not just we've watched videos and we're able to pass it on to, because the next generation, obviously, they won't have those experiences. Like for me, I don't have that experience with Atari 2600. I have to listen to people like you and those that had it to understand what it was like at the time, because I never had it. But I realized that my kids and kids, even going into early teens now, they would have never had the NES. They would have never had the Dreamcast. He didn't really know what Sega was a console developer at one point. I showed him the Dreamcast, and he was like, what's the Dreamcast? And it's kind of like, oh, you have no idea what there was before that. And yeah, it was just this really great experience of being able to educate somebody on something. But it's the first one I've had, and I was kind of like, well, I know the first person that I want to speak to now that I've had that experience is because you share similar aspirations in that sense as I do. But I mean that as I say, we could probably talk for hours, and I'm aware that I don't want to keep you for too long, and the sun is starting to come up here, so we won't keep it. But I wanted to finish on one thing: is that slightly away from that, I have finally. It's not a complete console collection, but I finally got my first complete collection of something, and that was a complete Kirby collection. I was missing one game. I'll never get the Satellaview games. I've accepted that. That's my asterisk next to my complete games. But I was missing one. I was missing one Super Famicom game that arrived this week, and so I'll be doing a video on that soon. But yeah, I was kind of like, this is my first John Hancock moment. I've got my first complete collection of something.
It's a great feeling. It's a great, setting a goal, no matter what it is, subset or all of one character. Like, it's a lot of fun. So congratulations.
Oh,
congratulations.
Thank you very much. And thank you guys for watching. This isn't a 2-part video this time. This was just a 1-part, but as I say, hopefully we'll do more. But we need to kind of. I need to stick. I've got my schedules here of what to talk about. I kind of need to stick to those because I know from last time we can probably end up making a video twice as long as it needs to be, and I'm aware that.
I'd love to come back. Not a problem.
Well, thank you very much, John, and thank you guys for watching. And if you'd like and subscribe below to both me and to John, I'll put links in the description below. But thank you for joining us, and I'll see you guys next time.